Assalamualaikum and good day. So, today we'll start with the first lecture on Introduction to Forensic Psychology. What is forensic psychology? The forensic psychology literally is a psychology to do with courts of law, and the origin of the forensic term is similar with forum, which come from the Latin origins. A forum is merely a room for public debates, and therefore the words of forensic. Next, what difference between forensic psychology and criminal psychology? Basically, criminal psychology is a psychological aspect of criminal behavior and includes issues such as origins and development of criminality. Whereas forensic psychology looks at broader definitions in order to include as much as criminal justice beyond courts of law in a psychologist's roles. Okay. Interesting about the definition of term of forensic psychology have changed somewhat over the years, and although there is probability greater consensus nowadays, these definitions are created for particular reasons and purposes in order to achieve particular ends. And interestingly, the earlier years of researchers are defining forensic psychology as a branch of applied psychology, which is concerned with the collection, examination, and also presentation of evidence for judicial purposes. And crucial to this definition for us to understand that the terms evidence and judicial, is related strongly with forensic psychology. And for example, like the British Psychological Society, they extend the definition of forensic psychology to include much of the criminal justice system beyond courts of law. Indeed, the British Psychological Society does not mention courts of law currently. Okay, so as you can see in this slide, forensic psychology is defined as deal with the psychological aspect of legal processes, including applying theory to criminal investigations, understanding psychological problems associated with criminal behavior, and the treatment of criminals. Okay, and next, similar with the American Psychological Association, even though the language is not so quite direct as British Psychological Society definition, forensic psychology is defined as the professional practice by psychologists within the area of clinical psychology, counseling psychology, school psychology, or another specialty recognized by the American Psychological Association. When they are engaged as experts and represent themselves as such in an activity primarily intended to provide professional psychological expertise to the judicial system. So, based on this definition, okay, the forensic psychology has become much more structured, okay, as a discipline, also based on the infrastructures that have been developed, okay, and in making progress to define the forensic psychology is also based on the differentiating between defining the field of the forensic psychology and also identifying who should be entitled to call themselves as a forensic psychologist. Okay, so the main question is who is the qualified, okay, who is qualified to call themselves a forensic psychologist? Is anyone can be a forensic psychologist? Okay, so this become issue, okay, the issue to identify the nature of skill and knowledge that are required by anyone working in the field, okay, apart from a basic training as a psychologist. Okay, so in UK, in the United Kingdom, it has been suggested that forensic psychologists should possess the following knowledge and also skills. Okay, there are 4 areas, okay, of practice. The first one, they must have understanding the conceptual basis in their work in context of psychology that are relevant to the criminal behavior, the legal framework, including the law and structure of the criminal justice system, for example, of the country in which they practice. Second, an understanding of the achievement and potential achievement of the application of psychology to the criminal investigation, the legal process, custodial processes, and also the treatment process, both for both offenders and victims. The third is understanding to the psychology that are relevant to the following individuals, including adults and children, okay, including the offenders, victim, witnesses, and also the investigators. Okay, and finally, an understanding of the practical aspect of forensic psychology in the term of following, such as different demands of for assessment, process of investigation, prosecution, and defense, decision making in respect of innocent guilt, sentencing, custody, treatment, and rehabilitation, approaches to assessment, and finally, the professional criteria to report, production, and giving the testimony. Okay, so these are the four knowledge and skills. Okay, now we look on the researchers practitioners. Historically and traditionally in psychology, researchers and practitioners were seen as at odds with each other. And each side being dismissive of the contribution of the other, and the academics usually will criticize practitioners for lack of knowledge in the pertinent of research, whereas the practitioners will criticize the academics for their ignorance of clinical needs and practices. However, recently, employers of forensic psychologists require that practitioners should participate fully in research-led discipline. So meaning that even though they are the practitioners, they also have to know how to conduct research. Basically, the purpose of research in psychology is to understand or to ground the discipline of social reality through the effective use of empirical research. So as you can see in the figure, illustrates some of the major component of forensic psychology, and how this component is widely drawn from the discipline of psychology. And also note that the underlying dimensions of applied research or practice as opposed to the academic. The distinction is not rigid, but nevertheless must be considered as essential component of the structure of the field. So the practitioners are applied, so mostly based on the polypsychology, investigative psychology, clinical psychology, and present psychology. They are who understand research method are much more likely to be able to incorporate the findings of other researchers into their therapies, assessment, and when giving their professional advice to client and colleagues. Furthermore, practitioners are usually in a good position to know what sort of research are needed by them as compared to academics, and whose knowledge of practitioners' requirement cannot be so direct. Indeed, the academics, researchers, may have academic and theoretical priorities that are different from the practitioners. So both are okay. There's nothing wrong between the academician and also the practitioners, because both have their own strength. But usually many academic psychologists make important contribution, even though they're lacking of the practical experience and training, because they are trained more in the theoretical perspective of a certain area in forensic psychology. Now we look on the historical origin of forensic psychology. It started in the 15th century, where the first English trial was actually accused, the acquaintance of the basis of insanity. But actually, until the 18th century, the court began to develop a criteria to assess the insanity. Basically, at first, the insanity is equivalent to wild beasts. They are not being defined as a mental illness. And starting from there, The medical actually at earlier time, the medical professions like doctor or psychiatry was not needed. Okay, it just based on the jury decision. However, towards the 19th century, where insanity become important issue, okay, and it's become part of the legal test of insanity, and finally towards the 18th, I think towards the 16th century, where the acceptance of the expert witness. So the court started to accept the expert witness with the increasing of frequency, and also as the consequence that lawyer became increasingly concerned that evidence of expert might replace the jury in deciding the verdict. Okay, however, there are also issues of competence of standing the trial. Okay, uh, where actually the main concept, the idea that defendant must be competent, okay, must be competent at certain minimal level in order to have the fair trial. So this is where from insanity develop into the mental health categorization, and toward accepting the profession of medical, and also the medical concept and mental illness and social problems into the court. Okay, so this is where um, we look on in earlier years of the history of forensic psychology. There are very little progress in concept of how to deal with crimes committed by the mentally ill. Okay, and uh, towards the 19th to 21st century, when there are more modern psychology and laboratory and also science through the findings, also the experiment. So this is where all the evidence can be presented in the court. Okay, and interestingly, in the 20th century, where development of the profession of clinical psychology, as you know, what we have learned in the clinical psychology course, where in clinical psychology, the professional are trained with the scientific base or very objectively based measure of assessment and also intervention. And assessment actually very helpful to identify what category of mental illness. Okay, and from there we can make decision whether the person is competent or not to stand for the trial. Okay, so these are just very basic of the milestone according starting from the 15th century to the 21st century on the how forensic psychology is emerged, right? Now we look at the European psychology's early contribution to forensic psychology. Okay, the development of modern psychology at the University of Leipzig in the late 19th century, as you can see from the previous slide, is actually quickly led to an interest in forensic issues. And it is accepted that the origins of modern psychology lie in the establishment of the psychological laboratory at this university in 1875, and it was part of the legacy of William Wundt to the psychology. Okay, so it was a number of William Wundt students, colleagues, and also co-workers who took the initial steps in developing forensic psychology. Okay, and though there are also other influences. Now we look one by one. Yeah. So, based on the development of the modern psychology lab by William Wundt, the first early contribution by Albert in 1897 century, where uh, he actually appeared at a Leipzig court in a role that some might describe as the first true forensic psychologist. He was early testimony into the effects of the media on matters relevant to the courtroom. He argued that witnesses at a murder trial confused their actual memories of events with the pre-trial publicity given to the event in the media. They were not able to distinguish between what they have witnessed and what they have read in the newspapers. And Albert actually described this memory effect as retroactive memory falsification. And related issues continue to be studied, although the researchers do not necessarily concur with Albert. For example, Robert and Lace asked whether children confuse television and real life event, And their answer was that children as young as 4 years old are good at identifying the source of their memories correctly, and significantly at lower age studied children can be confused into making errors by the way they are questioned. And next researchers, okay, is Cattell, century 1895. Cattell investigated using the techniques of laboratory experiment into human memory on the quality of eyewitness testimony. And based on his research, okay, included situational influences on eyewitness accuracy, as well as the issue of whether some individuals tend to be resistant to error and outside influences. Okay, another researchers, Binet, for example, is the originator of intelligent testing in France, also replicated Cattell's work. He focused particularly on the question of amenability of testimony to outside suggestion in interrogation. In Germany, at about the same time, another researchers, William Stern, also conducted research on similar themes to those of Cattell in relation to both adults and children. So these three figures, Cattell, Binet, and also William Stern, they are famous with their intelligent testing, developing an intelligent test. Okay, next, psychologist is Sigmund Freud. His idea about human nature so profoundly affected the legal system that he was given honorary doctorate in law. Okay, even though he did not write about legal matters, but his approach, okay, that relate with psychoanalytically that influenced the followers of the psychodynamic psychology, actually made contribution towards the forensic psychology area. Okay, so for example, such as the influences such as about the compulsion to confess, discuss the psychological diagnosis of the fact, okay, and then Carl Jung actually experimented with using word association, and also the characteristic of the delay of responding to the different words with another word. Okay, so these are example of the contribution by Sigmund Freud. In previous slide, we discussed about the European psychologies. Now we look on the American roots of forensic psychology, because in earlier years, there are actually significant numbers of early American psychologists actually trained at the William Wundt Laboratory, and they are either returned home or emigrated to the United States. So, the early works in the United States involve both American researchers and also the European immigrants. And it's interesting that it is not uncommon to find these immigrants identified as a major figures in the history of forensic psychology. So let's learn about these figures, yeah? Okay, now we look on the first figure, which is Louis William Stern, 1910th century. So he actually continued the tradition of testimony research in the United States, and interestingly, he actually introduced of realism to the study of testimony. In that, he introduced stage events into lectures. Yeah. At the same time, he also proposed two kinds of interviews called as open-ended and also closed-ended questions. Okay, and the open-ended allow the interviewee to give their accounts as free narrative by the using of open questions, whereas in the closed-ended, the interviewees answered a set of preset questions which are known as a closed questions. Next, Hugo Mastenberg. Okay, so he's actually the first major applied psychologist and also one of the most resolute. He was another of Wundt's students and he developed a lifelong interest in forensic issues. While still in Europe, he worked in support of Flemish weavers who were being sued by a customer. They were accused of supplying material of a different shades of color from that ordered. Then they disputed this. So Marstenberg, with the help of great physiologists of the visual system, Helmholtz showed that the apparent differences in color was a function of different lighting conditions involved. Okay, so the shades were not different. And after migrating to the United States, he found that the adversarial Anglo-American system of law was not so sympathetic to hearing psychological opinion as the European system had been. So, his interests were wide in the field of applied psychology and included the jury decision making as well as eyewitness testimony in the domain of forensic psychology. Next figures is William Marston. He's actually one of the Munsterberg's students. He's actually a cartoonist, and his main contribution in developing the lie detector test. Okay, he developed the lie detector test named as polygraphy in 1915. So his prototype of polygraphy was known as the systolic blood pressure deception test and employed repeated blood pressure measurement during questioning. He claimed that changes in systolic blood pressure are indicative of lying. Okay, and next figures is Carl Mulberry. He testified in court that human reaction time latency was such that an engine driver had no chance of stopping his train in time to prevent a crash. And this was possibly the first psychological testimony at a civil rather than criminal trial. So it is more on civil trial. So Marbury also argued in court that the alleged alleged victims of child sexual abuse made unreliable witnesses against their teacher. Okay, and this actually has changed a great deal in the society in terms of attitudes towards the children. And next is Louis Thurston. Interesting about his study, actually, his finding of a study on intelligence among the police officers in the United States. It was found that, in general, junior officers tended to be more intelligent than the older ones, and Thurston is one of the intelligence test developer, and suggests that the brighter officers tend to leave the force for more rewarding and stimulating work, leaving the less intelligent to be promoted within the police force, and this effectively was the start of study of police psychology. About forensics, the contribution to its forensic study is not only from one area of psychology. It comes also from the developmental psychology when we look on the custody decision. We also involve this clinical psychology where we look on the mental illness and competence to stand trial, for example, and also prediction for future violence for the parole decision. The social psychology on the interrogator's use of coercion, also persuasion, and finally cognitive psychology where we look on accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So this other area of psychology, developmental, social, clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, we look on what are the contribution and specifically in applied towards the forensic psychology. And finally, the modern development of forensic psychology are based on the formation of association. If there are strong association in supporting the forensic psychology, okay, for example, like in 1916 in US, the American Psychology Law Association was established, and it was influenced on the development of the professional education, for example, like the postgrad study, okay, and publication where it actually give more opportunity towards research, okay, and from there, when there are demands for the employment, increase of employment of psychology, okay, and also increased numbers of student training as a forensic psychologist, this actually offers the fuller professionalization of work and practice in forensic psychology area. All right, so that's about the forensic psychology based on the developed country. But in Malaysia, unfortunately, we still don't have our specialized in forensic psychology yet. Okay, what course been offered is more on the forensic science, but forensic psychology is not well developed yet. Okay, so I think that's all for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Have a nice day.